Astronomy is a great hobby if you're an insomniac. Let's face it, there's not much else to do at 3 AM. And if you're going to be staring aimlessly at the ceiling, or inside of your own eyelids anyway, why not try staring at something that's actually halfway interesting? At least, that's what I said to convince myself that lying on my back in my backyard every night for an hour or more was a productive use of my time, and not a flashing red warning sign for my mental state. In truth, what I was doing wasn't astronomy in the traditional sense. Hell, I don't even know the name of the constellations beyond the Big Dipper. I did buy a cheap telescope after a month or so of doing it, but after a few half-hearted attempts of getting the focus right, it's been gathering dust in my garage. Besides, I've always thought of myself more of a big picture guy. See, I've always had this weird, mostly useless talent for seeing order in chaos. Remember those spy picture books from when you were a kid? You'd get these big, high-res photos of a bunch of colourful trinkets scattered on a neutral background, or maybe some highly detailed miniature landscape, and you'd have to locate a laundry list of objects hidden in the mess. I always seemed to have a knack for opening those up, taking a glance at a page, and within seconds, not only finding the listed items, but mentally cataloguing just about everything in the scene and its position in relation to everything else. Even in seemingly complete chaos, patterns can be found if you know how to look. When you think about it, the night sky on a clear, dark night is really just the same concept on a larger canvas, with less differentiated objects and a constantly, minutely changing landscape. It took me a few nights, but I quickly developed the same instantaneous mental catalogue. I couldn't tell you what most of those bright points of light were called, but I knew each one, its brightness and quality, its relative position to its neighbours, the infinitesimal change of the big picture night by night, and the much quicker movement of the ever-orbiting planets. All of this to say, when I went out for my usual celestial stare on a motionless night a couple weeks back, from the moment I stepped out through my front door, I immediately registered the minute change in the quality of ambient light. And when I instinctively looked skyward, I immediately catalogued the 12 new points of light, roughly the brightness of Mars, scattered about 2 fingers' width of space between them in the northeast quadrant of the sky. I wasn't overly concerned at first. With my limited knowledge of the finer points of astronomy, I figured this was some easily explainable, albeit rare, occurrence, like a supernova or a previously undiscovered comet. But I was curious enough to do some Googling the next day, during the course of which I found nothing. No news reports, no press release from NASA, no discussion on the stargazing forums I occasionally check. I admit, I even snuck a peek at some conspiracy forums, looking for claims of a cover-up or media blackout of the event. Not even a hint. If I hadn't begun questioning my sanity at that point, I certainly did the next night. I woke up at the usual time to find that not only were those new points of light still there, but they were also ever so slightly, but noticeably brighter. They also seemed to have moved a bit farther apart, so that the entire system took up a larger space in the sky. It was then that I had the bright idea to take a photo. I pulled out my smartphone, aimed it at the new stars, or whatever they were, and my heart sank. Even in the grainy image my phone screen produced, I could more or less clearly see the stars I would usually expect in that position of the sky, but nothing more. Yet, looking up with my naked eye, there they were, brighter than pretty much anything surrounding them. If this was the beginning of my slide into psychosis, it seemed, for the time being, to be limited to a single delusion. I continued going about my days without any other strange occurrences to disturb my usual 9-to-5 existence. It was only at night, when I woke like clockwork to stare at those 12 lights, slowly but surely growing brighter and farther apart, that I experienced my apparent insanity firsthand. As the objects took up increasingly more space in the sky and in my mind, my curiosity morphed into unease. which soon began to taste suspiciously like dread. I had kept my mouth shut in the days following my discovery, until I began to notice the stars in the space between the new lights beginning to dim. When I woke up last weekend to find that those stars were almost completely invisible between their new neighbours, I knew I had to break my silence. If there was even the slightest chance this wasn't in my head, that somehow some massive celestial event was occurring that, for whatever reason, most people couldn't perceive, I had to at least try to get to the bottom of it. So, Monday morning, before I left for work, I visited the most popular astronomy forum I knew of, created a username I was sure nobody would connect back to me, and posted my question. Has anyone noticed any of the new lights in the night sky over the last couple of weeks? I checked back frequently over the course of the day to find the expected comments, mostly no in various forms, peppered with jokes about UFOs, accusations of trolling, and a few suggestions that I seek psychiatric help. It wasn't until I was winding down for the day, about to head home, that I received a notification for a private message. When I read it, I nearly fell out of my chair. 12 planetesimals between Boötes and Ursa Major? Please tell me you can see them too. I was flooded with relief and dread in equal measure. Great, I'm apparently not insane. But is the alternative any better? I replied immediately, and over the course of the evening, we shared our stories. She was an astrophysics grad student interning at some big observatory in Texas. She noticed the lights just a few days after I did, when she happened to be observing that segment of the sky during some routine work, but she kept it to herself when she realized her co-workers hadn't seemed to notice anything amiss. Since then, she'd been keeping track in her spare time, getting a look through the observatory equipment whenever she could, and using her own impressive-sounding array of home equipment otherwise. She confirmed with scientific rigor what I'd come to expect. They were small planets, or at least planet-like bodies, and they were getting closer. She couldn't account for the fading stars between them, but she'd be getting a chance to spend some time with the observatory's most powerful telescope in a couple of days for her own research, and she invited me to join her. I'm not sure what she thought I'd be able to contribute, but I suspected she just wanted to see with her own eyes that there was someone else sharing this impossible experience. I could certainly relate. So, after trading enough personal details to confirm that neither of us was an axe murderer, I called in a sick day and booked a flight to Austin. I wish I'd stayed home. Honestly, I wish I'd never looked skyward in the first place. I've long accepted that there are some things that can never be fully understood. Now I've seen the other side of that coin. With some things, we're really just better off not seeing the full picture. So, this is where the magic happens, I said, trying to make some sense of the myriad equipment surrounding us. More or less, these won't be of any use to us. Annie, my newfound partner in insanity, waved to a collection of screens. As you found out yourself, these things don't show up when you try to record them indirectly. For whatever reason, it's got to be good old-fashioned analog. It was well past midnight, and we had the observatory to ourselves to begin our... Well, I wasn't quite sure what Annie was hoping to achieve that night, if she even knew herself. Just some sort of progress toward understanding this thing, I'd wager. The topmost of the planetesimals, as she insisted on calling them, had already risen above the horizon when we arrived, so we wouldn't be waiting long to begin our observations. Over cups of overbrewed Folgers, we got to talking more about our experiences while we waited. I mentioned my uncanny and generally useless knack for pattern finding. You know, you'd be surprised. That sort of thing could be really helpful in my line of work, she said. If you're interested, you should look into going back to school for it. Well, that is if... She trailed off, but I got the gist. The elephant in the room. If this thing is really physically happening. But what does that mean for us puny humans? A rock the size of a city probably killed off all dinosaurs, so a dozen planets, assuming that's what they are, could probably do far worse just by getting a bit too close to Earth. I decided to change the subject. Is that what got you into astronomy? I'd imagine that's a common talent around here, if it's so useful. On the contrary, I was always terrible at puzzles and Where's Waldo and that sort of thing, she said, a wistful look coming to her face. No, I know this sounds like woo-woo, but I've always just felt a connection with the cosmos. Like, I look up at the night sky as a kid, and I get this intense sensation, like I could feel the radiation coming off of those distant stars. She sipped her coffee absently, clearly lost in thought. When I got my first scope, I'd just pick a star, focus on it, and stare at it for, Jesus, hours sometimes, trying to memorize its luminosity, its colour, to understand it as fully as I could. She shook her head, coming out of a daze and clearly a bit embarrassed. Yeah, anyway, I knew I wanted to be an astrophysicist ever since, so here I am. I'm not sure what exactly is in store for us. Me, Annie, the entire human race. But even in a best case scenario, it pains me to know that, after what we saw, Annie will never be able to look skyward in the same way again, with wonder and amazement, not horror. Annie glanced at her watch. Well, it's just about time. You ready to get up close and personal with these things? I guess so. Here's hoping we get to the bottom of this, I said, raising my coffee cup in a mock toast and not sounding particularly hopeful. Well, if my calculations are correct, and assuming that these are actually planetesimals, we should be able to make out some surface features tonight. I felt a surge of adrenaline at the thought, and not a very pleasant one. I hate to admit, I hadn't considered that. What would we see on these things? Mountains, oceans, signs of life even? The possibilities were endless. While I ruminated, she walked purposefully over to a complicated-looking console surrounding a binocular viewfinder and began expertly fiddling with a dozen buttons and toggles, a virtuoso at a stellar Steinway. As she worked, I heard a mechanical whirring above our heads, presumably the telescope moving into place. Okay, local time is 2:46 local. I'm commencing observation with the northeasternmost body, which will be temporarily labeling Object Alpha. I figured she was talking directly to me, until I noticed the audio recorder she had placed on the edge of the console. Taking detailed notes, even on a phenomenon barely anyone could see, and exactly nobody could even begin to explain. Scientists. Surface features are definitely coming into view. Let me just fine-tune the focus a bit. A small whir. Well, I don't know what I was expecting, but I wouldn't have guessed this. The object does appear to be planetesimal, though I'm not even sure how this is physically possible. She paused, took a swig of now lukewarm coffee and rubbed her eyes, though I'm sure her vision wasn't the problem. Yes, the surface appears to consist of an unmarred, highly albedo material surrounding a crater of some sort, though the crater is, well, it's a perfect circle and does not appear to be reflecting any light, though for reasons stated in previous sessions, I can't use proper instrumentation to confirm that. Here, come take a look at this. She switched the recorder off and gestured at me. I peered into the viewfinder. Her description was pretty much spot on. A thick, featureless, silvery white ring surrounded a circle of pure black. Even without any scientific expertise, it was easy to see why the inner circle was so strange. How deep would a crater need to be to reflect zero light? Then again, was it really any stranger than planets appearing out of nowhere that only two people could see? We spent the next half hour or so zooming from object to object, with Annie carefully recording her observations. Each one was more or less the same. Bright, almost shiny outer ring. Big black circle crater. On some, the celestial feature was much larger, reducing the outer ring to a thin halo. On others, it was small, almost a pinprick against the luminescent surface, though no less pitch black. One appeared to have almost indiscernible thin squiggles of dark red radiating here and there from the central circle. Annie speculated that these might be lava flows of some sort, though noting that the resolution at this distance was still too low to make any meaningful conclusions. As we progressed, Annie falling into a workmanlike rhythm, pausing only to kindly offer me the viewfinder at each object, I began to feel an unpleasant sensation gnawing at the edge of my consciousness. You probably know what I'm talking about. It's a bit like when a word is at the tip of your tongue, or when you're struggling to remember what you were talking about before being rudely interrupted. It's the feeling I get momentarily while first gazing at a particularly detailed one of those I Spy puzzles, and on those very first few nights of stargazing. Okay, last but not least, one more view before we shut down for the evening. This has certainly been intriguing, if inconclusive, Annie said, with more than a touch of disappointment. After all, as strange as the objects were in close-up, we were seemingly no closer to determining what it all meant. Zooming out for a full system view, a short whir, and here we are. Nothing much new here, though you can just make out the central crater-like features on objects Alpha, Eta, Iota, and Lambda. She gestured for me to take the viewfinder once again while she continued to dictate. I gazed once more upon that impossible pattern etched into the night sky and in my brain. Only this time, something finally clicked. The pattern in the picture, the order in the chaos. The apparent effects of the system on the surrounding interstellar medium remains a total mystery, perhaps some gravitational lensing. And his now monotone words faded from my perception, replaced by a buzzing whir echoing in my skull. I had seen it. It was so glaringly, impossibly, horrifically obvious. Annie? I barely whispered, the contours of darkness surrounding the object, obscuring all behind it, the massive, inexplicably black circles in the fields of smooth white. Even, in some inexplicable way, the notion of it appearing out of nowhere and nothing, visible only to those somehow attuned to see it. It all made sense. It was altogether senseless. Annie? I repeated, louder this time, though with considerable effort, my vision blurring, my body filled with pins and needles, that noise in my head. Whir, sticking around, maybe for good. For all the data I've collected so far, I'm unfortunately no closer to identifying the origin of these planets. What's up? She turned to meet my eyes, an expression of professional bemusement giving way to confusion, and just as quickly to deep concern. I looked like I felt, I suppose. Annie, those aren't planets, I choked out. What? What can they be? How do you... They're not planets, I repeated, more forcefully, knowing she'd come to the same terrible, profane epiphany as I had the moment I told her, forcing the words out like bile. Their eyes. I have this memory from my childhood. It's one of those memories that's most likely a dream, but my recollection of that night has always been so eerily vivid. Let me explain what might have happened. There was a long period of time during my childhood when my single mother worked night shifts as a nurse. Shortly after this happened, I actually begged her to switch the day shift, because my nightmares were keeping me from getting a full night's sleep at my grandmother's house. I think I was 8 when this event in question happened. For context, my grandmother only owned one TV, which was in a room, and off limits after her bedtime. Being a curious and imaginative kid, I didn't find it difficult to occupy myself without it. Grandma had a whole shelf in her study dedicated to short story anthology books. She had a lot of the general classics too, like Dracula, The Jungle Book, Jane Eyre, all kinds of novels. I ate up these stories like a ferocious little bookworm. I also discovered the alarm clock in the spare bedroom was a radio alarm clock. During these sleepovers at my grandmother's, I enjoyed tuning the clock radio to different stations. There was something about catching voices and music between the radio static I liked. I would imagine I was a spy, using my radio to eavesdrop on my enemies. With a yellow notepad, I'd scribble notes from AM broadcasts. I know that's a little weird, but hey, I was a bored kid past the bedtime without a TV. I had to get creative. While tuning the radio late one night, I stumbled upon the most intriguing station I'd ever found. I remember the broadcaster went by Vernon. His voice was perfect for radio. He sounded similar to Vincent Price, although his voice was lower and his inflections even more drawn out. He kept the same smooth, perfectly even tone throughout each sentence. I distinctly remember even feeling a twinge of envy when I realized he could read out loud without fumbling over a single word, something I personally struggled with. 8-year-old me was intrigued by how engaging Vernon seemed, as well as the station's content. Even though I only listened once, I remember Vernon spent much of the airtime reading letters from fans. Most of these letters were confessions of disturbing thoughts the listener were having and wanted to act on. Afterward, Vernon would gently explain how these thoughts are perfectly natural, and how it was part of the human condition to crave control, especially over something or someone more vulnerable than yourself. I remember one of these stories particularly well. My next letter is from longtime listener Gideon Miller. He began, "First, Gideon, I would like to thank you for tuning in. It's the support from our contributors that keeps our show running. I found your story most intriguing, and I'm thankful we get to share it with our audience today." Gideon writes. Vernon made a throat-clearing sound before continuing. "Dear Vernon, first off, love your show. I have never told anyone this, but I feel it's time to share with someone who won't pass rash judgment. You are always so rational and logical regarding the human need to participate in violence. I know you'll be the perfect person to share my story with. I killed a classmate of mine in high school. We were competing to be the best athlete on our school's track team. This kid, let's just call him Mark, infuriated me because I was doing track for genuine scholarship and career opportunities, and he admitted he was only doing it because his parents said either he had to play a sport or get a job. He said he figured running in circles was the easiest way to get out of work. But that wasn't the torturous part. What infuriated me the most was how much better Mark was at track than I was, in spite of how much more of a damn I gave. It was maddening to know how hard I trained, and knowing Mark would just blow off practice and still somehow pull ahead at the track meets. He set new records for the 400 and 800 meter dash. He was almost always chosen to be the anchor in relay races. Looking back, I don't blame the coaches for giving him as much attention as they did. The kid was naturally gifted. He could run like the wind. But I wanted some of that attention too. I craved praise. In my heart, I believed if I got rid of Mark, I would earn some of their affection. So, I devised a plan. I don't want to give you too much detail about what I did and where we were exactly, because I don't want your really curious listeners to go snooping for answers to mysteries that aren't any of their business. I remember Vernon gently chuckling after this line, although I myself found nothing humorous about what he was reading. Still, morbid curiosity kept me listening. I lured Mark out to a nearby lake under the pretense that we would race on the shore. In order to conserve energy, I did not give my best efforts during our races and allowed Mark to win every time. After I thought he'd been drained of enough energy, I suggested we cool off by taking a swim. No, you didn't, I thought at the time. Please tell me you didn't actually. I drowned Mark once I determined the coast was clear. Vernon continued reading the letter. There was no hitch, no hesitation in his voice. I personally remembered needing a moment to process this story, to figure out if it was true or fake. Obviously, he was no first timer to these kinds of stories. Calm as a cucumber, Vernon read on. He struggled for a long time, but I was committed. It was a good thing I'd taken the time to make him run off some of his power. If I hadn't worn Mark down, he may very well have overtaken me, but I got him in the end. I won. The police never found out it was me. They never even brought me in for questioning. Their investigation was so sloppy. One thing I do remember is a rumour spreading that one of our notoriously strict track coaches had done it, and although it was eventually ruled as an accidental drowning, he resigned due to pressure from parents and the staff. We had a memorial for Mark, and a guest speaker provided a presentation to our grade on swim safety. Everyone on the track team received extra leeway to excuse ourselves to the counsellor's office whenever we felt like going. I felt victory after victory. Once again, I was undoubtedly the best sprinter on the track team. I pushed myself to beat Mark's records before I graduated, and I succeeded. I received a full-ride scholarship to a good college. All of these good things happened because Mark died. At least, that's how I justified it in my head. It was easy. Thank you for giving me an outlet to tell my story, Vern. As I said before, I've never shared it with anyone else. Not my parents, not my older brother, not my wife. It feels good knowing my story is out there. I don't have a lingering sense of guilt or anything. Quite the opposite, in fact. I believe my actions led me down a more fortunate path. A small sacrifice was necessary to propel me to better opportunities. I earned my place in society by offing the competition, just as nature intended. At this point, I was on the bed, covers pulled halfway over my face, hardly breathing. Gideon's story entranced me. Of course, Vernon's delivery had me hooked as well. Although Gideon only seemed concerned with the good fortune that came to him after he'd murdered Mark, I wondered about Mark's family. Did they miss him? Did his parents have other kids, or was he the only one? What was life like for them after he didn't come home that day? My own father had died in a car accident just a few years prior. I think that's why I spent a few moments pondering his family's adjustment after Mark's death. It hit a little too close at home. When I began listening again, Vernon was discussing Gideon's letter. What I found most disturbing was how quick he was to praise Gideon for what he'd done. Gideon, your actions were merely a strategic maneuver to get yourself ahead. I congratulate you in succeeding. Society wants us to believe that it's wrong to have violent tendencies, when in fact, these are the most natural habits we possess. We praise apex predators for using their power to get ahead. Why not humans? The most successful societies are those who have overtaken others and claimed ownership of the land, and the land's resources and people. Think of how powerful we could be if we no longer forced civility, if we didn't punish ambition. Even though Vernon spoke as calmly as if he were reading off a recipe, I remember these ideas terrifying me a little bit. I didn't want to have to conquer and kill my competition. Did that mean people like Gideon and Vernon saw me as someone deserving of being conquered? Unfortunately, I did not have much time to dwell on this. Vernon's next statement quickly caught my attention. Thank you all for supporting my humble broadcast. I want to give a shout out to a first-time listener this evening. Tonight, I have Maya from Arizona tuning in. My heart felt like it sank to my stomach. Maya is my name, and I live in Tucson. I gulped. Vernon continued. Maya, I know these ideas can be difficult to wrap your head around at first. However, I am far from the first person to propose conquerors deserve the world. We are holding back our own potential by demanding politeness. If we rose up and demanded more freedom to conquer others, within a few generations, we may very well have a race of superhumans. I don't know when exactly I rose out of bed to change the station, but it was not long after Vernon began his horrific monologue about how it should be acceptable, legal even, to simply overpower and off your competition in everyday life, all while addressing me by name. But that wasn't the worst part. Like most radio clocks, you change the station by tuning the small wheel on the side. I'd had enough of Vernon and his disturbingly smooth voice, but when I moved the wheel, Vernon continued speaking. "Maya, I do hope you will have a change of heart one day and tune back into my station. I've enjoyed presenting my ideas to you. I am always eager to speak to someone whose mind is as young and fresh as yours." As he talked, I remember desperately turning the wheel as far left and as far right as it would go, but no matter what, it would not change the station. Finally, I just yanked the plug on the radio clock. The room went quiet. The sound of my racing heartbeat was in my ears, but the room itself was dead silent. Letting out a long sigh, I walked over to the trash can and dropped the clock in the bin. I slid under the covers once more, attempting to clear my mind of Vernon's podcast and Gideon's letter. Somehow, I willed myself to sleep. The next morning, I awoke at my normal time, about an hour before I had to be at school. I knew what time it was because, to my horror, the radio alarm was not in the garbage, but on the end table, plugged in with the time set. When I left the spare bedroom, I found my grandmother at the stove in the kitchen, cooking cream of wheat for breakfast. Without a word, I sat at the dining room table. I did not ask her if she put the alarm clock back in its place, but she did not ask me why it was in the garbage. I wanted to assume she did it and never find out otherwise, so I made the choice never to initiate any conversation about it. I am almost 30 years old. This memory still haunts me. It very well could have been a dream, and that still seems to be the most plausible explanation. There were just so many little details that seemed impossible for a dream to convey so vividly. How was an 8-year-old subconscious mature enough to concoct a story about a boy killing his classmate, then justifying it? My dream brain even went so far as to give specific names. Something else I've considered is that I was in a state of dreaming where the audio from the radio or TV transfers to your dream if it's turned on. That would mean Vernon's podcast was real, but it doesn't explain how he was able to address me. I don't know, and I don't like to overthink it. What I do know is this: I don't like to listen to the radio. Even in my car, I listen to music via Bluetooth. Before that, I always had a CD playing. I've never come across Vernon or his creepy podcast again. Maybe it wasn't real. In fact, I hope it was only a morbid creation of my dreams. I hate to think Vernon is truly out there, using his platform to justify cultural shifts to pure, primal, survival of the fittest type civilizations, with no consideration for the human capacity to regard ethics and morality. But another part of me still wonders if he's out there, feeding his dangerous ideas to his audience night after night. I'll never know, because I'm too scared to tune a radio ever again. I'm going to start by saying I'm not big into conspiracies. While I know there's a lot of secrecy and sketchy goings on out there, I've always held the belief that most things should be taken at face value, and not everything is as shady as some people tend to believe. However, what happened to me 3 months ago has never been discussed since, on any news reports, police files, or even gossip around town. It's as if everyone decided what happened didn't. But it did. My name is Travis. I'm 19, and I live in a small town about 20 miles north of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We have a smaller population of around 3,000, which is big enough that not everyone knows everyone, but if you tip back too many bottles of moonshine and ride your prize cow into town to declare your love relationship with Twinkies, the entire city will be gossiping by morning. Most people in town take the 20-mile trek south for work in the big city, but not me. I've worked on my family's wheat farm since I was little, and it's the only job I've ever known. I know my father's plan is for me to take over operations of the farm when he retires and support him through his final days. This may be selfish, but at the age of 16, I knew this wasn't for me. It's the same repetitive day-to-day work. The only freedom I receive from this monotony is when I have to transport harvested grain to any of the nearby cities. I will admit, I'm never in a hurry to come back and tend to get lost in the big cities, causing me to come back home late. When I saw what else there was besides my dreary life back home, I wanted to do everything I could to move to the big city life and live how I wanted. Little did I know, my motivation to do this would skyrocket in one night. I had finished my work early for the day because my friend Mason and I were planning to head to the plains outside of town and test out his new rifle. Sounds very hillbilly, I know, but in a town like this, we have very little as far as entertainment. Mason had been my best friend and neighbour my entire life. Well, neighbours here being about a half-mile apart. We were even born a week apart and always held a strong kinship like brothers. We did everything together. To cap off my day, I always logged the amount of grain harvested that day and placed in the silos at the other end of the farm. Most people don't realise there's actually a lot of paperwork involved in farming wheat. Whilst deep in said paperwork, I began hearing a very low-tone rumble in the distance. This was not concerning at first, since another popular form of entertainment with the younger folk is riding dirt bikes. I shrugged it off and hastily continued my work to leave before it got too dark. But dusk was ending fast. As I threw down my initial to finalize the last of the forms, I was able to lift my head out of work. The rumbling sound continued and was louder than before. At this point, I knew this was not the sound of dirt bikes. It was a strange, almost screechy noise coming from outside. I threw on a sweatshirt and walked outside while trying to identify the noise I was hearing. As I walked outside, I felt a sort of charge is the best way I can explain it. My arm hair stood on end as a very light wave of what felt like static electricity wafted through me. It wasn't painful at all, but noticeable. The screeching continued, and it was only when I walked outside I realized it wasn't coming from north, south, east, or west. It was coming from the black, empty void the night sky had become once the sun set. At this point, the screeching almost had the inflection of howling, as it would kick up and die down within a matter of seconds. The closest I can compare this sound to is when someone drags a chair across a hardwood floor, except amplified hundreds of times over. Was this an echo from the factory at the edge of town? Did one of the neighbouring farms purchase a new machine that was malfunctioning? I knew none of this could be right, because the sounds were coming from directly above me. We had no mountains to echo sound, and were surrounded by nothing but horizon, yet it reverberated everywhere around me. At this point, I wasn't the only one to notice, much to my relief. I could see porch lights coming on in the distance from my neighbours across the way, and watched as they slowly came out of their houses to figure out the same mystery I was perplexed by. A few seconds later, I heard my back screen door open behind me. My parents had been awakened by the sound and came to investigate as well. "What the hell is that sound?" my dad said in his traditional Midwest accent. "I don't know, Dad, but it started up about a minute ago. I thought it was the Thompsons playing around on their bikes again, but it's coming from the sky," I replied. "Damn idiots crop dusting this time of night. I'm sure to bring this up at the next town meeting," he snapped back, clearly frustrated by his sudden awakened state. "That ain't no crop duster, Henry," my mom chimed in. "It sounds like one of those underwater documentaries I like where whales talk to each other. Except this doesn't sound right." It was at that point my dad fell quiet and stared at the ground. I couldn't tell if he was really just trying to figure out what was happening, or if he was simply irritated by Mum's description of sky whales. "Do you think we should call someone?" I said, breaking the awkwardness as the screeching in the sky continued. My mum looked at my dad for his response. Nothing. He continued to stare at the same spot on the ground. His face was emotionless. I began to realize something wasn't right. I approached my dad and grabbed his shoulder. Dad? Are you okay?" I asked, with one eyebrow raised. As soon as he felt my hand on his shoulder, he jerked his shoulder away and began yelling. No words, just yelling, as if he was terrified beyond reason. His eyes were wider than I'd ever seen them as he fell to the ground, with his hands straining in front of his face. He was straining so hard, every vein in his hands, arms and neck were popping out. I leapt to him to try and hold him and calm him down. Dad, what's going on? What's happening?" I yelled frantically. I looked back at Mum, who was in a state of shock, watching this situation unfold, holding her hand over her mouth. His screaming continued as he took one swipe towards the ground, digging all 5 of his fingers into the dirt, almost as if he was trying hard to get himself back up. "Mom, call an ambulance," I yelled while restraining my dad. Without a word, my mom ran into the house, eyes still wide open. My dad had made it to his knees, still screaming in terror as the sky above continued its bellow. His hands still stretched in front of him, strained as if he couldn't possibly close them. His wide, open eyes slowly moved towards mine. He stared at me, mouth wide open, as if he was screaming without making noise. His eyes had turned blood red at this point. That's when I witnessed my father begin tearing at the flesh of his own face. I tried to stop him, but being twice my size, I've never been able to come even close to outmuscling him. Gushes of blood poured down his neck as he continued tearing at his own face. He dug so deep, I could see muscle and cheekbone. I'll never forget how he continued to stare at me as he tore apart his own face. I didn't know what to do. I ran into my mom, who was on the phone. "It's a busy signal! It's a busy signal!" she yelled in frustration. "Mom, Daddy's going insane or something. He's scratching at his own face and I don't know what to do," I frantically shouted. We both ran outside to see my father laying face first in the dirt. His screaming had stopped. He was still breathing heavily, but seemed to be unconscious. My mom and I looked at each other in disbelief. I walked over slowly. I decided I needed to get him into the house and tie him down before he woke back up. Hopefully by then, we could get an ambulance here to help. But the damage was done. I grabbed his arm to turn him over. That's when he leapt at me, knocking me on my back. He climbed on top of me and began screaming uncontrollably again, with blood and flesh dripping on my face. I began screaming as well. Out of desperation, my mum grabbed a brick from the unfinished patio my dad was building. She hit him in the back of the head as hard as she could. My dad fell on top of me, unconscious. The sky continued its screeching. I pushed my dad off of me and looked up at my mom, who was in a state of shock at what she had just witnessed. She fell on her butt without changing her expression. "Mom, we have to get to Mason's house and get help," I said, trembling. She didn't move. I knew I had to take control, despite my extreme terror I was feeling inside. I picked my mom up off the ground, and we started our walk to my friend's house. The shrieking sky continued as we slowly walked. The sound faded in and out. As soon as I thought the sound might have ended after the last wave, It continued again. My mom didn't say a word the entire walk. It was then that I noticed the static feeling had not gone away. My hair was still on end. We finally arrived at Mason's house. My tunnel vision had lightened up during the walk due to the fright of what happened. I pounded on the door, yelling Mason's name. No answer. It was then that I looked across the street and saw his closest neighbour in the window of his house. He was writing on his window with a marker. Eyes wide open, like my dad. Except, he wasn't tearing himself apart. He was calmly writing, and writing, and writing. I looked a little closer at what he could possibly be writing on his window. It was gibberish. Non-discernible words. As I looked closer, I noticed the same writings were on the walls in the room he was in. He had been at this for several minutes. What was happening? Is everyone going insane? Is this roar from the sky turning everyone into a mental case? I began knocking harder. Mason finally answered. He grabbed me immediately and hugged me. "Travis, please help me," he said with his face buried in my shoulder. "What's happening?" I replied, not ready to admit I came for his help too. "My mom has stuffed herself in the linen closet and is rocking back and forth, talking to herself. She seems completely gone. I don't know what to do." He timidly answered with tears in his eyes. His father died when he was 3 years old in a motorcycle accident, so he had been the man of the house his whole life. Right now, though, he was at a loss as to what to do for his mother. He led us to the closet, which was closed. My mom started to come out of a catatonic state and realized what was happening. I knocked on the door. No answer, just a low voice. She was talking to herself. "Miss Danvers, it's Travis and Mason. Can we help?" I asked as nicely and politely as I could. She continued talking, but not to us. I put my ear to the door. I could hear what she was saying. "Why did you buy that death trap? Why did you leave me? I don't deserve this. You're selfish. You left me. You left me. It's your fault. You left me. Why did you buy that death trap?" She continued. "I think she's talking about your dad," I said to Mason as he stared at the door. I continued. "It's like she's gone into some kind of psychosis." I tried to open the door, but Mason stopped me. "No, I tried to get her out of there. Every time I opened it, she screamed. Really loud," he snapped as he grabbed my wrist. A loud bang erupted from outside before he could finish his sentence. We looked at each other and ran outside to see what happened. A car had slammed into the front yard tree. "Oh my God," Mason yelled as we ran to the car to help. My mom stayed behind, continuing to try and break through to Mason's mom. We ran to the car to try and help whoever was in the accident. Before we got there, a man kicked his car door open and began firing a shotgun into the air and yelling, "Get away from me! I don't know who you are!" He yelled, firing into the air in all directions frantically. The noise in the sky seemed louder than ever. Mason and I ran back into the house, locking the door behind us. That's when the man noticed we were there. He ran up to the door, trying to get in, slamming his shoulder into the door. I was able to deadbolt the door in time and ran to my mom. A blast came through the door. He shot the damn doorknob. He continued with 2 more shots, creating a large hole in the door. The shooting stopped. I could hear him reloading the shells. After a few seconds, he began kicking in the rest of the fragile door to make room to enter. I began grabbing my mom to take her out the back door when I saw Mason walking down the hallway from his bedroom. I didn't notice that he had left. At this point, the man was halfway through the door with his shotgun pointed right at us. Boom! I closed my eyes tight, covering my mom. All I could hear now was a terrible screech from the black sky outside. Other than that, it was eerily quiet. I opened my eyes. Mason was standing beside me with his new rifle aimed at the front door. I nervously looked towards the door. The man with the shotgun was hanging through the door with blood dripping from his neck. Mason got to test his new rifle after all. He slowly lowered the gun and appeared to be in complete shock. "He was going to kill all of us, Mason," I said, attempting to console him on what he just did. He didn't respond to my statement. He simply said, "We have to get out of here," in an almost whispered tone. I nodded as I grabbed my mum's hand to lead us out. "Let's get back home and grab the car keys. They're on the kitchen counter," my mum yelled as we exited the back door. Right now, I was just glad to hear my mum speak. We ran back to the house as quickly as possible. The sky seemed even darker than ever, with the roaring of the sky continuing. Mason and Mum waited by the car while I ran in to get the keys. They were right where she said. I grabbed them and began to head back outside. I heard a pounding on the window behind me. It startled me as I turned around quickly. My dad was in the window. He had torn up more of his face. I could see the roots of his teeth through his lips. I gasped and stumbled back. I ran outside to the driveway. "Get in! Get in!" I yelled as I unlocked the door. They did what I asked and rushed into the now unlocked car, not knowing where my new panic state came from. They realized why quickly. I heard my mom scream loudly from the back seat. I looked up. My father was coming after us, dripping in blood, with chunks of flesh falling to the ground. I turned on the car and looked backwards to back out. The car wasn't moving. I yelled in frustration as my father hurled himself against the car window. Both Mason and my mom screamed this time. "Damn it!" I yelled as I realized I'd put the car in neutral. I slammed the gear stick into reverse and began backing up with tires squealing. The sound from the sky actually masked the squealing of the tires as it continued its echoing roar. My dad tried to hang onto the car, but fell to the ground as we backed out of the driveway. He continued tearing at himself as we drove off in the direction of the big city. It was very soon after we started driving that we realized the gravity of what was happening. Entering the more residential part of town, we had to swerve over and over to avoid people who were wandering the streets. Many seemed lost. Some were yelling at nothing in particular. We passed by a naked woman in the street who was spinning in circles, looking up to the noisy sky. Admittedly, there were several people who didn't seem affected by whatever this was. They were running around, yelling for help. We could not stop to help them. We had to keep moving. No one in the car argued with that. As we approached the city limits, a man darted out into the road, arms stretched on either side, yelling for help. He slammed his hands on the hood as I screeched to a halt. He was terrified. As he started to walk around to my side of the car, a dark figure came out of nowhere and tackled him to the ground. I leaned forward, looking out of the window. The shadowy figure repeatedly stabbed the frightened man in the neck. I still remember the gurgling sounds to this day. "What the hell?" I screamed involuntarily as I screeched off. I heard a clunk from under the car. I looked back in the rearview mirror, and with the haze of red from my taillights, I could see I smashed one of the psychotic man's legs. He continued stabbing away as if nothing happened. "Damn it, damn it, damn it, damn it," I continued, not realizing I was even speaking. My eyesight had been completely tunnel vision out of fright at this point, making it difficult to focus on the road. As we began cruising, things started to calm down. No one was talking though. The sound, that sound from the sky, was beginning to fade away. I felt a sense of relief as the tingly static feeling began to fade away almost simultaneously. Mason let out a sigh of relief. Nobody spoke until we got to town. The city was peaceful. People were walking along the sidewalk without a care, dining in restaurants, walking their dogs, hanging outside the bar. Nothing had happened here. "Should we go to the police?" Mason said, breaking the silence. "They have to be aware of what's going on," I replied quickly but unsure. "No, stop at the closest motel," Mom yelled from the backseat. "We have the gun. If whatever happened back there reaches here, we need to be bunkered down and ready for it, not surrounded by people." I couldn't come up with the mental fortitude to argue her point. I stopped in the closest motel. It was dingy, but from where I come from, I wasn't bothered. Mom hurried to speak to the desk clerk and paid for a room. For safety, she made sure we were on the second floor. None of us slept. We turned the TV on to try to get any information we could about what was going on. To our shock, nothing. No breaking news reports, no emergency broadcast system, not even a mention of the screaming sky. How was this not being acknowledged? Morning broke as the longest night of my life ended. The city was still normal. After a few minutes of the three of us deliberating on whether or not to head back to town, we agreed to at least stay one more night and head back in the morning. That day, there was very little word said. We barely ate. I tried to call home around noon. No answer. Mason tried to call his mom's cell phone. No answer. Another sleepless night came and went. When morning hit, we jumped in the car and took off for home. Conversation in the car was a lot more heavy this time. We went back and forth, trying to wrap our heads around what happened. What was that sound in the sky? Why was everyone going mad? Why is there no mention of this in the neighboring cities? As we arrived in the suburban area, we noticed a serene ambience. Birds were chirping, dogs barked in the distance, and no sound was coming from the sky. It was eerily quiet. As we drove, a younger woman walked out of her house in a jogging outfit and headphones. She began running in place as she locked the door, turned, and began jogging. This was the same street I witnessed a violent murder, and she was just going for a jog. As we continued, people were going about their business, much like in the big city, buying groceries, hanging out at the coffee shop, and smiling as if life was great. A chill ran up my spine as we pulled into our neighborhood. A fright came over me as I heard a roaring in the distance. This time, it was definitely the dirt bikes. We pulled into our driveway slowly. As we got out, we surveyed the area. No blood, no body. My dad was gone. We searched the entire house with no evidence anything had happened. We walked over to Mason's house. The front door was fixed. That or replaced. I don't know. We entered the house and a smell of bacon emanated from the kitchen. "Where the hell have you boys been?" Mason's mom yelled as she flipped a pancake on the stove. "Mom, are you okay? What happened?" Mason replied sheepishly. "I'm just mad you didn't come home last night. If you were going to stay at Travis's, you can at least let me know," she retorted in a stern voice. My mom and I left back to our house. I looked across the street at Mason's neighbor. No writing. It was in permanent marker, yet there was no sign of writing, not even faded markings. We got home and phoned the police. When they arrived, we told them the whole story. They acted as if we were crazy, even going as far as blaming it on a localized hysteria between the three of us. I knew what happened, and it was real. The only thing we could do was report my father missing. Since then, there has been no trace of him. I moved out 3 weeks later. Mason and I were able to get a job in the city working a warehouse. Not much better than wheat farming, but it's paying for our place. We are currently roommating, and we barely bring up what happened 3 months ago. My mom decided to stay, and with the savings she had, hired farmhands to help out. She decided to start her retirement early. It will take me a long time to come to terms with what happened. The loss of my father will forever haunt me. The sights I saw are still in my dreams. Sometimes, I swear, I hear the sound the sky made that night start in the distance. I get a flash of terror, followed by relief when I realize it's not happening again. But what did happen? Nobody in the small town has said anything about what had happened. Nobody in the city has ever mentioned anything either. But all three of us remember it vividly. How could my father just disappear like that? Was this some government test that went wrong? Dare I say, could it be aliens? Or could this be a natural phenomena that's never been recorded? No matter how much I try to piece what happened together, nothing makes sense. Why was the sky screaming that night? I had been working there for just over a year when my manager asked me if I wanted to switch to the overnight shift. I was promised more hours, and it came at a time where I really needed the money. Like many others who worked there, I kept telling myself I wouldn't get stuck in that place. I'd refuse promotions and leave when I saw a better opportunity. That kept repeating in my head, even after I'd been offered the chance to manage the overnight after working it for a few months. I'd basically been doing the same thing I already was as a trainer, and I'd made more. Not much more, but any bit helped. So begrudgingly, I took the promotion and started to oversee the overnight. Nothing changed other than noticing just how often overnight workers came in late or just didn't come in. Even at a place like McDonald's, it was tough to find people who wanted to work through the night, so upper management tended to turn a blind eye as long as the food was going out. It went like that for another few months. Things weren't great, but I was making enough to barely skate by, and I'd gotten to know the overnight workers fairly well. I would have been content to work that night shift until my better opportunity revealed itself, if it wasn't for that one night. People like to make up stories about the places they work. They like to say they see a ghost, as if a dead person is clinging to the downtown Tim Hortons. What happened to me, though? It's undeniable. I didn't see some floating orbs or watch a door open on its own and psych myself out or anything like that. I'll just start with a call I had come to expect at least a few times a week. Before the evening shift even left, I received a call that one of my overnight employees was going to be late. He gave some half-hearted excuse, not even bothering to put in the effort to make it sound believable. We both knew he just wanted to be late, but what could I do? It was a Tuesday, and so it would be pretty slow. Payroll dictated that it would just be me and Ryan, the one who would be late. It would be annoying to work the store alone until he showed up, but you get used to angry customers who have to wait on their food. I watched the sun go down and the sky grow dark as customers and workers alike left the building one by one. I could already tell it was going to be a quiet night. As the clock hit 11 and there was still no sign of Ryan, I got up from my seat in the office and went to lock the doors to the lobby. We stayed open all night, but only the drive-thru operated after 11. I was told it was to cut down on labour, but I was never too certain about that. Other stores kept their lobbies open in much worse neighbourhoods. It slowed down traffic though, so who was I to complain? With a heavy sigh, I looked over the parking lot through the windows to see if Ryan had made it yet, but the place was empty. Even the roads were devoid of any traffic. I felt bizarrely isolated looking at the dark windows of surrounding businesses. Moving back to the kitchen, I started cooking some meat and dropped a basket of fries. Just as I expected, time went on, and within an hour, I only had to serve 2 customers. One was a family of 4, clearly on a road trip as they all had blankets on their laps. I was worried they were going to order something large, but they just needed something to snack on. The other car was a man, clearly well on his way to intoxication. I could smell the stink of alcohol when his window opened to pay for the 5 McChickens. He would certainly need all the bread. Not sure about the grease though. A while passed as I swept the floors and played around on my phone in the office, making sure to circulate the cooked meat so nothing got too stale. It's not like I really needed the help, but I was getting annoyed regardless. Plus, I was the manager, so I picked up the phone and called Ryan. My eyes rolled as the ringtone continued to play until his voicemail chimed in. I hoped that maybe he was driving when I noticed headlights illuminating the dim lobby area. Moments later, I heard a pounding on one of the locked doors. It was either Ryan or someone thinking the lobby was open. Hoping it was the former, I left the office and walked through the kitchen to the lobby. When I could finally get eyes on the door, there was no one there. Even the headlights I had noticed were gone. I thought someone threw something at the door, but there was nothing on the ground. I stood for a moment, seeing if Ryan was just messing around, when the ding from the fryer nearly made me fall backwards. It was the last batch of nuggets before I had to start switching to the breakfast menu. Taking one last look at the parking lot, I noticed that although the headlights were turned off, there was indeed a car sitting in the lot. Choosing to ignore it, I walked to the kitchen and pulled the nuggets out. Then I attempted to call Ryan again. This time, being sent straight to voicemail, I prepared myself to work the entire shift alone. Another customer came through as normal. Some teens that were partying late and wanted, quote, whatever nuggets you have left. I boxed their chicken product and handed them the food. As they drove away, I suddenly descended into darkness. All the lights in the store flicked off, except the faint glowing red numbers on some of the machines. It was rare but not unheard of that the power would go out. You just had to put a new fuse in the breaker. The pain in the ass was that the breaker was located by the menu board outside, so I would have to leave the store in the middle of the night alone. The inconveniences of that night were starting to pile on. Clutching my fingers with keys in tow, I once again made my way from the office through the kitchen and into the lobby. I stopped right in my tracks as my fingers laced around the door's chilled steel bar. Just as I was about to unlock the door, I noticed that other than the car, there was a figure standing in the parking lot. Without the interior lights illuminating the individual, I couldn't make out any features, only that they were too tall for it to be Ryan. "Lobby's closed," I robotically voiced, just under a shout, hoping they would just leave. I didn't want to step out with a stranger standing there. What felt like a handful of minutes passed as I made eye contact with the stranger, small glinting beads that I assumed to be their eyes anyway. From within the kitchen, I heard the familiar plastic bounce of a warming tray hitting the ground. It startled me enough to grab my attention. As I turned my head, the store became flooded with light again. Confused, I turned back to the parking lot, hoping to get a better look at the stranger. But when I did, there was no one there. My headset chimed to alert me that someone was waiting in the drive-thru, and I shifted gears to talk to the customer. I was getting nervous, and the thought of hearing another person was enough to soothe me. Reaching my finger to the talk button, I began to speak when I was interrupted by a high-pitched whining, the type a stadium microphone would give out from interference. I had heard it before, almost every day, but in the quiet store, it sounded so loud, almost like it was playing through speakers. A knee-jerk reaction caused me to fling the headset to the ground. That's when another loud bang came from the door beside me. Out of sheer frustration, I dropped the hardest F-bomb of my life and turned to the door, ready to lash out at whoever was messing with me. It's burned into my head. Every time I have the audacity to try and shut my eyes, he's always right there. Ryan's body pressed up against the glass door. His uniform's blue colour perfectly complementing the fresh red stains running down from his chest. I could see the heavy breathing spewing from his mouth, painting the glass a frothy grey. His eyes burned with such a fierce terror that they nearly froze me. As I fumbled with my keys, I leaned in closer to reassure him that I was coming. The hand he had placed in the glass started to slip down, leaving thin veins of red. His pinky and ring fingers were just gone. The skin was jagged and loose, and a hint of white protruded. It was like a damn bear assaulted him. As his hand slipped through, I could see the small silver glint of something watching me, just behind Ryan, waiting for the door to open, for Ryan's body weight to make closing it again a nearly impossible task, waiting to get inside. The plumes of breath that Ryan was exhaling became thinner and less hearty as my fingers refused to open the door. My eyes shifted between Ryan's and the stranger. Each time I would go back to Ryan's eyes, they would be softer and holding less fire. His body slumped, and the light from inside the McDonald's began to cast on the stranger. The thing was barely human. Its skin was so ragged and old, it looked like his body had been wrapped in an old leather couch. The small beads of light that I assumed to be his eyes were just bits of metal that had been embedded deep into the socket, causing the skin around his eyes to tear apart, revealing a blue interior. Its mouth was closed tight and constantly shifting between a forced smile and a downer frown, almost like it was chewing emotions. Ryan was long gone. I could see only the front of him still, but judging by the bits of normal fleshing poking out between the creature's poor excuse for lips and the amount of blood still pooling, it was safe to assume all his major injuries were focused on his back. I couldn't help but picture the mangled mess that I wasn't able to see. I recoiled from the door, nearly dropping my keys. The thing outside the door grinned so wide, it was clearly trying to show me its teeth. Teeth that shined under the light, just as his eyes did. A horrible display of sheet metal dentistry with bits of Ryan stuck between. It began moving its jaw back and forth, and as the metal began to grind against each other, I heard the unmistakable high-pitched whining. I couldn't understand how the noise was so loud until I looked around to see the same beady eyes mobbing the outside of the store. I had been serving customers the same garbage quality meat for years, and now there was a group of customers gnashing at the teeth to get something a little fancier. They began to bang their hands against the glass in unison. I could almost feel the store itself shaking around me. I could see shreds of flesh being stuck to the windows when their fist made an impact. Fumbling for my phone, I cursed at myself for somehow forgetting the 3-digit phone number, but quickly went to punch it in. What the hell could I even tell them? If I told them what I was seeing, I would sound completely cracked out. If I said it was just a break-in, then they'd ask why the alarm wasn't tripped. The damn hungry things continued pounding away at the windows and doors until it caused a throbbing in my head. I could barely hear the phone as I put it up to my ear. I expected it to start ringing, but it never did. Just the hiss and static, barely audible over the interference those creatures were causing. I couldn't get a call out with them. I started rushing to the office, intending to use the landline phone that Ryan rang to call in late. As I headed into the kitchen, I heard an unsettling snap from behind me. Turning around, already knowing the worst, I could see a large spiderweb crack forming on the glass. Forget calling the cops. There was no way they would even make it in time. Walking backward, my foot landed on the discarded meat that had fallen out of the tray warmer earlier. It sent me reeling to the floor, and I landed hard on my tailbone. It took my breath away momentarily, and I stared at the meat as my composure returned. There was another snap from the lobby. This time, it sounded sharper, like the window was about to give way. There was a door in the back that has an alarm on it. We use it for deliveries and taking the garbage out. you need a key to disarm it. But if you didn't, an alarm would sound and maybe the police would show eventually. But the glass wasn't going to hold out. I needed a way to exit that door and run as fast as I could. The noise of the alarm would no doubt alert whatever those things were. Looking to the tray of slowly aging meat and the pile of french fries sitting under the heat lamp, I had one plan I could put into action. Quickly pulling out whatever trays I could manage to hold, I headed over to the drive-through window. I opened the window and quickly tossed the meat out as far away from the store as I could. Almost instantly, the pounding stopped, and I heard the bizarre shuffling of what sounded like chalk rubbing against the sidewalk. I didn't stop to dwell on it. I just kept alternating between grabbing more trays and throwing them out the window until they were all empty. Then I chucked nugget boxes full of french fries. Stopping for just a moment, I watched the huddled mass of those creatures, all different heights and builds, scavenging through the food, grabbing chunks of it and hurling it into their mouths like animals. The drive-through window was thankfully on the opposite end of the store as the door was, so with my morbid curiosity filled, I turned and began my sprint. I was sure those things would make their way through the food in no time, so I didn't hesitate. Busting through the back door, I heard the loud, siren-like chirping of the alarm going off behind me, filling the night with its call. The sound dimmed as the door slammed shut, but it would continue to go until it was turned off. The night was brisk against my bare arms as I pumped them as hard as I could, running into a nearby open field. I didn't know where I was heading. I just wanted to get away. I could hear small scrapes of chalk clinking away at the parking lot behind me. The things were already on my tail. Still, I ran, harder than I ever thought I could. Eventually, I reached the other side of the field, where a 24-hour supermarket would act as my sanctuary. I didn't think about the horrors of leading those things to more people until I hit the pavement again. Turning around to see if they were still following me, I saw the group of them, all stood still in the field. It was as if the earth itself was calling them back. They slumped over in unnatural ways to press their bodies against the grass. It was similar to what quicksand does in cartoons. Their shapes pulled down into the dirt and absorbed by the field until it was empty. I couldn't tell you how long I stood and stared at the field, just waiting for one of them to pop up like the end of some 80s slasher flick. It never happened. Eventually, the alternating lights of a police car did come into view. I wanted to run, but I started walking back to the McDonald's, making damn sure to avoid stepping on the field. I was worried about what was going to happen to me, worried about the state of the store, and of course, the body outside of it. When I returned, however, there wasn't a body in sight. Only various chunks of hamburger. Even the plastic trays were ripped apart and gnawed at. The windows were worse for wear as well, with pieces of glass ripped out where the crack first formed. There were still some shards at the base of the window, but not enough to account for how much was lost. There are cameras inside and outside of the store, but to add to the inconveniences, only the ones inside were working, so the footage just showed me maniacally running around until I freaked out so much that I started throwing food out of the window. Without evidence otherwise, I just explained I'd gotten into it with a customer. I left with a lot of questions unanswered, but it was enough for the cop to let me go, and enough for McDonald's to let me go, like firing me. So, that was my final overnight shift at McDonald's, and will likely stay with me long after I've forgotten about ever working there. I still go there sometimes, drive by slowly in the middle of the night. He's always there, always watching me drive by the place, my headlights reflecting off the shards of glass pressed into his eyes. And honestly, I'm just surprised Ryan gets there on time. They said the house we moved into was nearly 100 years old, and I believed it. A pretty structure on the far outskirts of Berlin. Our new house stood 2 stories tall, encased in a crisscross pattern of dark wooden framework. Outside the windows were balconies full of flowers, and the entire left side was overgrown with ivy. Inside, the place was dark and wooden, but intricately elegant. On the left, the entry hall continued back to the kitchen and dining rooms. On the right, a staircase climbed its way to the second-floor landing. I stood at the fork, a suitcase in each hand, gawking at the ornateness of it all. My sister, Lena, pushed past me, stomping up the staircase in a needless hurry. When I realized what she was doing, I chased after her. The suitcases did nothing to aid my speed. Lena reached the second floor and burst into the first bedroom on the right, spinning to take in the view. It was deliciously spacious, complete with an adjacent bathroom, 2 windows, and a walk-in closet. Lena tossed the luggage onto the bed and turned to face me. "Fine as keepers, Axel. I got it first, and I'd like some privacy if you don't mind." "Lena, please," I said, still panting from the journey up. "Mama said I could have the upstairs." "You can. There are 2. Yours is across the hall." She smiled at me and nodded out the doorway. On the other side of the upstairs landing was another door. The cheap white paint was visibly flaked and cracked, even from this distance. I winced at the sight of it. "Please close the door on your way out," said Lena, using a cell phone camera to inspect a makeup job. Across the landing, I set my suitcase in front of the door and tried the knob. Glass instead of metal. But it wouldn't budge. I rammed my shoulder into it, and when that didn't work, I planted my feet firmly on the ground and pressed against it with my back, putting all my weight into it. This time the door opened with a violent shudder, and I went reeling into the floorboards in my new bedroom. The space was empty, save for a single bed frame that stood no higher than 2 feet off the ground. A rectangular skeleton that threatened to break under the weight of even one person. The walls were cream-coloured and cracked. The windows were 1 instead of 2. A naked light bulb jutted from the ceiling, a single string dangling from it. On the far wall, close to the ground, was a single vent. Aside from these basic necessities, there was nothing. I had half a mind to march back to Lena's room and demand a room change. The other half of me knew this was a useless pursuit, and I was too tired to initiate such a conflict. I'd spent all day in the backseat of my car, longing to stretch my legs past a 90-degree angle. I spent the rest of the evening hauling luggage up to my second-floor bedroom and installing pieces of furniture that did little to make it more inviting. Lena's room had a view of the surrounding houses, but from my single window, you could see only the trees of the forest behind our house, and the sun setting behind them. By the time I finished my job, nighttime had fully taken over. The bedroom had become atrociously dim, seeing as the only light bulb was weak and on the verge of blinking out altogether. I'd snapped on some extra lamps I'd installed and examined my handiwork. There was now a dresser up against the wall, a nightstand near the bed, a clock, a rug, and a mattress on the bed frame, complete with a blanket and pillow. The dresser and nightstand were decorated with framed photos of our family, some dating back to the 40s and 50s. My grandparents when they were only children. Grandpa Werner in front of his shoe store, our last name, Schumacher, translated quite well to the English words shoemaker, a business that had run in the family for decades. There were black and white family photos taken in front of this very house. It had been inherited, of course. With my grandfather's recent death, he'd left us the house, and my father was intent to move in instead of sell it. I was sweaty from so many treks up the stairs, and it was a long walk to the bathroom down the hall to wash my face. Damn Lena. So I flopped onto the bed, shielding my eyes from the bulb with one arm. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, the clock on the wall read 5:30. In less than an hour, I would be getting ready for my first day at a new secondary school. It was still dark outside. What had woken me up wasn't an early bird or an alarm clock. I'd woken up to a breathy sound, like air being blown in short bursts. By the time I sat up, it was gone. I listened for a while, and it started again. The breathing. Paranoid, I leaned over to look between my legs, but beneath the bed was empty. I pulled open the drawers in the dresser, lifted the mattress, checked out the nightstand. I ran my fingers along the windowsill to check that it was shut tight. The breathing sound continued, soft and slow, in and out. Sometimes it stopped completely, but it always started up again. Eventually, I put my ear to the wall and began to slide along it, listening for the source. The breathing was louder now, and I flattened myself to the plaster, moving from wall to wall as quietly as I could, as though a sound too loud might scare the thing away. I knelt down, crouching further and further, until I faced the vent, where the breathing was the loudest. It was a large vent, a rusting metal grate that seemed older than the house itself, held in place by the way of 4 screws. I tried to see beyond the slats, but there was only black. The breathing was so close that I could almost feel it on my skin, weak and rasping. "Hello?" came a voice from beyond the vent. "Who's there?" I froze, dead in my tracks, my skin prickling with goose flesh. The voice was distinctly feminine and very high-pitched. It was so weak and so quiet that the words sounded as fragile as glass. She was as afraid as I was, and perhaps that was the only reason I responded. "I'm Axel," I said truthfully, after a long hesitation. "Axel Schumacher. What are you doing in our house?" There was a long pause. The breathing stopped again. "I live here," whispered the voice, her high-pitched words echoing from the metallic world of the vent. "It isn't safe out there, Axel Schumacher. Not for me." Silence. "Not anymore." "Why not? What's wrong with you?" The words were harsher than I'd intended. I couldn't see much, but there was movement behind the slats as the girl shifted her position. "We're a different breed, you and I. Can't you come out? I can help you, get you to the police." "It doesn't work that way, Axel." I sat upright on my knees, my hands on my lap. I could feel her exhalations from the vent, but they were wretchedly cold, like flurries of snow. "How long have you been there?" I asked. "A long time. Too long, in fact. Now I'm the only one left. Everyone else is dead." A chill ran down my spine that had little to do with the girl's breathing. I swallowed and said, "Who's dead?" I waited, but this time the girl didn't respond. After a while, faint sobs began to seep through the vent, echoing as if from far, far away. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to upset you." Silence. And then the deafening blast of an alarm clock, startling me out of my skin. I reeled backward and scrambled for the off button, suddenly remembering my school day ahead. I stumbled away as if walking from a trance, staring at the vent in utter horror. There was no breathing. There was nothing. I snatched my school bag and a fresh set of clothes. I changed in the bathroom down the hall, where hopefully no one could see me. Just as I was about to shut the door, however, the voice returned. "Axel?" it said, quiet, almost inaudible. I turned back to the vent, watching the black slats intensely. Please, don't leave me. I stepped back into the room and crouched low. We'll talk more when I get home from school. I won't tell anyone about you, I promise. Until then, will you at least give me your name? The breathing was slow and methodical. Even from this distance, I thought I could feel the chill in the air. In and out, in and out, ragged and diseased. My name is Lorelei. We'll talk after school, Axel Schumacher. Wolfram Secondary School was close to the house. So close, in fact, that I began walking there instead of asking for rides from my parents. I had enough on my mind anyway. I wanted to be alone. It was hard to focus on my new classes when my mind kept drifting to Lorelei and her melancholy voice. I found myself daydreaming in class, doodling what I imagined she looked like on sheets of notebook paper. I was rudely interrupted when my notebook slammed shut, flattening my pencil and sending a long scroll of graphite across my illustration. I looked up into the face of Mrs. Walter, who had been lecturing the class on geography a moment before. With my ears pinched tightly between two fingers, I was dragged down the hallway to Principal Krause's office. Mr. Krause was a lanky man with big hands and a mustache. He examined my illustration, not with distaste, but with a stern interest. "Who is this Lorelei? Is she a friend?" said Mr. Krause. I shook my head slowly, regretting that I'd written her name in the first place. I'd drawn her as a blonde girl. No colour with pencil, of course, so I simply left her hair unshaded. Thin and plain, with sad eyes and fair skin. I'd given her summer dress with flowers on it. It was what her voice brought to mind. "No one," I said. "I made her up." "Well," said Mr. Krause, "at least you're no stalker. I hope you know Wolfram is not a school of the arts, and as such, I'll be keeping this for now." And he shut the notebook in the top drawer of his desk. At home, I stopped downstairs to collect two things. The first was an apple, and the second was a screwdriver from my father's toolkit. Then I was taking the stairs two at a time and rushing into my bedroom, shutting the door behind me so our voices wouldn't drift into Lena's room. "I'm back," I said breathlessly, crouching in front of the vent. "Lorelei, I'm back." At first, the only sound I heard from inside the vent was a faint scratching. Faint but continuous. "I missed you, Axel," said Lorelei at last. "It gets lonely when I'm by myself." Scratch, scratch, scratch. "I missed you too," I said. "I can't believe I'm saying it, but I missed the girl inside my wall." I blushed, realizing I may have overstepped. The scratching continued. "What are you doing?" Lorelei said, "It's hard to keep track of time, being here for so long. Scratching tallies into the wall helps me remember how long I've been back here. One tally for one day at a time." The scratching stopped. I remembered the apple and screwdriver in my hands. "I've been thinking about it, and I'm curious about how you get food and water. You must come out sometime, unless you have your own restaurant back there." "You're funny, Axel," said Lorelei, but her voice was humourless, and she didn't laugh. "I told you that we're different. I don't need to eat anymore. I don't get hungry, but I do miss the taste of food. Sometimes I like to remember my favourite foods." "Everyone likes to eat," I said bluntly, but at this, Lorelei didn't respond. "I brought you an apple, if you'd like one. It can't be healthy, not eating." "I do miss the taste of apples." "If you want it, you're going to have to do something for me first," I said. What's that? I want answers. I like talking to you, but I don't know anything about you. You live inside my wall and I don't even know who you are. A long, ice-cold exhalation seeped through the vent slats. Maybe I like it that way, but I'll play along. I sat upright, placing the apple on the floor in front of me. Question 1. Why isn't it safe for you to leave? There was a long silence. She was carefully weighing how much information to give away. Bad people, Axel. There are bad people who want to kill me. Next question. It wasn't much, but I had a feeling it was all I was going to get. Question 2. You said that people died. I want to know who died. Another long silence. In my short time with Lorelei, I'd grown used to it. Everyone. Friends. Family. People I was close to. People like me. I hadn't heard of any large group of people dying anytime recently, and part of me wondered if Lorelei was making things up or telling half-truths instead of the full story. If she was telling the truth, the people like her were all in hiding. That option seemed much worse. Question 3. What do you look like? Like I said, Axel, I don't need to eat. The apple I can take or leave, and there are questions I don't feel comfortable answering. Not right now. I sighed. She had a point. It was useless to bribe her with food if she didn't want it in the first place. I assured myself that I would get answers later, one way or another. The important thing was that she was here and no one knew about her. Slowly, methodically, I used the screwdriver to remove each of the 4 screws bordering the vent. Then I removed the grate and set it aside. Beyond, there was only blackness. I thought I saw movement, but it might have been a trick of the eye. Leaving the apple placed in front of the vent, I stepped back a few paces and waited. Only Lorelei's voice emerged. Please, don't look, Axel. I'm not ready for you to see me. Not yet. I turned around. I might have respected Lorelei's wish if there hadn't been a mirror hanging on my wall. Too curious to look away, I waited to see what happened next. From the dark rectangle of the vent emerged a hand. So pale it was white, with yellowed fingernails and crooked fingers. Her arm appeared up to the elbow, bearing open sores and great patches of rotted flesh. In one spot, I thought I could see exposed bone. Lorelei's broken fingers curled around the apple and she pulled it into the maw of darkness. You can look now, Axel. I turned around, my heart thudding in my chest. I had to force myself to move slowly, not wanting to give away any urgency of closing the wall between us. I replaced the grate and twisted all 4 screws into place, then sat back while Lorelei chewed on the apple. She said between great, crunchy bites. I had almost forgotten what they tasted like. Apples. Better than I remember, in fact. Vibrant, like seeing colours after living in a world of black and white. There are more in the pantry, I told her. Lots more, whenever you'd like. Thank you, Axel. Lorelei, I said, my mouth going dry. Are you sick? Sick? She sounded surprised. I wished I hadn't said it. In what way? I don't know. I'm sorry, Who are you talking to? Came a voice. It was harsher than Lorelei's. I whirled around to find Lena standing in my doorway, the door wide open. "I closed that for a reason," I said, quickly standing upright. I held a screwdriver behind my back. Then his eyes drifted from me to the vent, then back to me. "I don't know what you're doing, but it's weird. Since we moved in, all you've done is spend the whole time in your room, and I swear that you've been talking to someone. I don't know what you think you're hiding, but I'll find out. I always do." "Is that all?" I said. "Actually, I came to tell you that your backpack was in the kitchen." She dropped my school bag onto the floor and pulled the door halfway shut. "Whatever creepy boyish thing you're up to, could you make it quieter? Goodbye, Lena." She closed the door. The moment she did, I crouched before the vent. "We'll have to be quieter, Lorelei. My sister is starting to suspect something, and if you're in as much danger as you seem to believe, I can't risk you getting caught." "I had a sister once," said Lorelei distantly. "Once." I spent the whole night talking to Lorelei, hugging my knees to my chest, leaning sideways against the vent. Each of her breaths brought with it a cold expulsion of air, but even that was oddly comforting. Lorelei's answers about her past remained as vague as ever, so I stopped asking. She wasn't comfortable with the subject, and I didn't want to pry. Our conversations moved to more superficial areas, discussing the outside world and what she'd missed since she started hiding. She wouldn't reveal how long she'd been hiding behind the wall, but I guessed it had been a while. She wasn't familiar with any of the TV shows and movies I mentioned, and had no clue about any of the local businesses. I showed her my iPhone, which she examined through the vent, fascinated. "That's amazing, Axel. It really is. I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything so bright." "Yeah, but it does more than glow. You can call or text people, play games, and this is Instagram." Lorelei asked about the world outside, and I told her what she wanted to know. She asked about me and my family. When it came time to leave for school again, I almost didn't go. That day at Wolfram was worse than the last. I kept falling asleep because I'd been awake all night, and students were giving me strange looks in the hallway. A group of girls whispered under their breath while staring in my direction. I was the weird new kid who always seemed to have his head in the clouds. When I was sent to Principal Krause for the second day in a row, my parents were phoned and were informed of my dissatisfactory behaviour. When Principal Krause stepped out of the room for a moment, I stole my notebook from the drawer of his desk. After school that day, I slipped my drawing through one of the open slits in the vent. "I drew a picture of you," I told her. "I don't know what you look like, but this is what I imagined. If you hold it up to the light, you might be able to see it." "It's beautiful," said Lorelei. "It really is, but it's not." I swallowed. "Is something wrong?" "Well, it's not entirely accurate." That was okay. I knew it wasn't accurate. I couldn't get the image of her arm out of my head. Her arm with its sores and wounds. The fingers that looked broken and irreparable. I wondered briefly if she had been in some sort of accident. A car crash or something. It would explain why she didn't want me to see her. That was okay. I loved her anyway. "I love you, Lorelei." "I love you too, Axel." Over the next few weeks, my performance in school hardly improved. My parents confined me to my room in off hours, a punishment I had little objection to. It was more time I got to spend with Lorelei, curled up in front of the vent, telling each other secrets. I often spent all night talking to her, reading to her, showing her drawings I'd made. I brought her apples that I snuck from the pantry, and occasionally removed the vent to hand them off. I pretended to close my eyes, but never did. And even though I was often exhausted during the daytime, sleeping the afternoon away, Lorelei claimed she didn't need to sleep. just like she didn't need to eat. She said that she liked to watch me while I slept. She remembered when she could dream like that. Each day, a new tally was scratched into the wall behind the vent. By the time 2 weeks had passed, I had already been suspended from Wolfram Secondary for doing nothing aside from draw, daydream, and fall asleep. My parents were disappointed, understandably, but the time off left me holed up in my room with nothing to do but talk to Lorelei. That was okay, because she was all I could think about anyway. I wanted badly to see her. I wished that she could come into the light, if only for a moment, to talk to me. I'd already made up my mind that if she was disfigured by some sort of illness or accident, it wouldn't bother me. Our bond had never had any element of physical attraction in the first place. I told her this too. One day I said, "Lorelei, are you awake?" "I'm always awake, Axel." I sat parallel to the vent, cross-legged, staring at the opposite wall. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. I want you to know that I like you for who you are, your personality, your thoughts and ideas. Those are what make you a person, not your appearance." "Those are very kind words, Axel. I appreciate it." "That being said, I'd like to see you. Come into the light for just a moment and we don't have to leave my room. It's safe out here." From inside the vent, I could hear her shift uncomfortably. She said, "I like the darkness." "Then I'll come see you," I said. "I can fit through the vent. I just want to see your face." "I don't know, Axel." I was already twisting screws out of the metal gate. I could hear footsteps clacking across the wooden floor outside my bedroom. Lena. I snatched the flashlight from the nightstand and pulled the grate aside, squeezing myself through the hole. It was a tight fit, but not too tight. Unsurprisingly, the vent led not to a metal shaft, but to an open room, hidden discreetly behind the wall. I wiggled through head first and pulled my legs through last, then immediately held the metal gate flush with the hole. The screws were still on the floor outside, so I held it in place with my fingers. The moment I did, the glass doorknob jiggled and Lena burst into the room, stopping mid-sentence. "Who are you talking to?" I watched her through the narrow slits of the vent. She spun around, searching for me, confused. From behind me, I could feel Lorelei's ice-cold breath waving against my neck. It was the first time we'd been in the same room. Lena noticed the screws and came so close that all I could see were her sneakers. A disembodied voice hand-plucked one of the screws from the ground. Lena crouched into view, peering through the slats, but I knew she couldn't see me. The darkness back there was almost supernatural in its ability to hide things just beyond the vent. I held my breath anyway, not daring to move. She tugged at the grate, and I fought to hold it in place. And when it didn't budge, Lena gave up. She frowned directly at me and left the room, shutting the door behind her. I let out an audible breath and pushed the vent to the side. Switching on the flashlight, I spun to face the room behind me. It wasn't large and disastrously unfinished. The walls were comprised of ancient wooden boards, but the most peculiar thing about them were the tally marks. There were thousands, small lines etched wretchedly into groups of 5 that blanketed the walls entirely. Line, 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 slash. Line, 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 slash. My flashlight swept the place, taking it all in, illuminating a number of tallies that were too many to count. Later, when I had the courage to enter the house again, I would count the tallies and learn that there were exactly 28,000, dating back to 1943's war-torn Germany, when a Jewish family of 3 sisters and a mother was hidden in this very room. After the residing German family were captured and executed, There was no one around to remove the heavy furniture blocking the false vent in the wall. The people inside had no choice but to starve. But it wasn't the 3 skeletal bodies on the ground that bothered me. It was the ice-cold hand on my shoulder, the one with broken fingers and nails like razors, that unsettled me the most. I spun around, shining my light into the face of a corpse that was long dead, and yet, somehow, not dead at all. Her skin was white, her black hair stringy and falling out, her nose entirely gone, revealing an upside-down, heart-shaped gap in her face. She had both eyes, but they were dry and lifeless, and her gaunt cheeks were teeming with maggots that weaved in and out of her flesh, which had irrationally failed to decompose any more since her death 77 years before. Her thin lips peeled back to reveal rotted, brown teeth, and when she spoke, her throat worked hard to produce a sound that had any resemblance to what it did in life. "Am I beautiful, Axel Schumacher?" said Lorelei in a melancholy voice. "Won't you kiss me?" My grandfather was dying. It hadn't come as any great shock. A year prior, he'd got the diagnosis the family were dreading: dementia. My great uncle had it too, and my grandmother, both dead. Within the year, physical effects were starting to take their toll. His memory was slipping more often. He was still at home, but a nurse came every day. At least twice a week, I'd pop in after work to see him. Some days it was good. He was the grandfather I remembered. Witty and charming, a genuine twinkle in his eyes, and a bit cheeky to anyone and everyone. He'd tell me stories like he used to, about his days as a fisherman in the bay, and the weird assortment of friends he'd collected over the years. The other days were bad. On the best of the bad, he'd sit silently, maybe mumbling to himself. On the worst, he'd rant about how poorly he thought Harold Wilson was doing as Prime Minister, even though the man had been dead for 25 years. A week before he died, I left work early and drove over to the little cul-de-sac he lived in. The nurse was just leaving. "Hello. Hello, you going in to see him?" "Yeah. He's on pretty good form today." "Okay," I said. Good. The nurse left and I ventured inside. He was laid back in his usual chair, looking out through the large living room bay window. Beyond the hills outside was the usual strip of blue, a glimpse of the sea blending into sky. "Hello, Grandad," I said. "Hello, Chris," he said. I went over, hugged him hello, then headed to the kitchen, newly spotless after the nurse's visit, to make tea. He took his cup with shaky hands and took a sip immediately with a satisfied sigh. "You make a good cup." "Thanks, Grandad." "How was work?" I shrugged. "Usual stuff, I guess. Nothing too exciting." "A job's a job." "Exactly." He sat up in his chair and sighed as his bones creaked with a strain. "And how's that girlfriend of yours?" I smiled as he chuckled to himself. My suspicions, never confirmed, were that my grandfather had been a bit of a ladies' man in his day, at least before meeting my grandmother. Although he hadn't met Beth yet, the fact I'd finally found someone I clearly liked brought him some quiet sense of pleasure, at least when he could remember who Beth was. They'd never met, but I thought he'd have liked her. "She's good. I'm picking her up in an hour." "Don't let me keep you here," my grandfather said. No, plenty of time." "You've got to live life whilst you can. It'll go quick." I nodded. "Sounds like a cliché, because it is, but that doesn't mean it's not true," he muttered. My grandfather looked out the window and took another gulp of his tea. Things will happen in your life that'll be on your mind forever. But if you have a good girl like... He waved his arm. Beth? Yes, he said. Like Beth. If you have someone like Beth with you, you'll be happy. Where'd you meet her again? Just walking along the beach. Walking? Yeah, she just started talking to me. She talked to you? I nodded. I told him the story a few times, but he couldn't seem to pin down the details. Well, he said, very forward, but that's what they're like these days. It sounds better. My grandfather chuckled again, then stopped. I followed his eyes to the television, sat directly in front of him. It was off. Only his reflection bounced back. His head jerked around to look at me. Your job pay well? I shrugged. It's a start, really. It pays okay. His head jerked back. I watched as his left hand found his right and began to pick at a loose strand of dead skin. Beth's job actually pays better, I said. You've got to be able to look after her and yourself. I said nothing, but nodded again and took a sip of tea. My grandfather gulped down the remnants of his own. Did your parents talk to you about the fish drought in 1959? No. It was bad that year, but you've got to provide for people. It was before your mother was born, and of course, she might not remember, though I'm sure we must have mentioned it. His hand twisted the skin back and forth. All the fish started drying up. The stocks. Oh, right. Like now? Declining? No. They all went. Very quickly. We weren't that big back then. It was a proper village, not like now. Only a few thousand, I suppose, my grandfather said. I sat forward to listen to another tale from the sea. Many of them were funny, but my grandfather's eyes seemed dull. He was somewhere else. We'd been married, your grandmother and me, but your mother was a year off or so. I'd been fishing for, 5 years proper by then, but longer really. I was working on Jim Grant's boat. We noticed within a week, less and less of a catch. Right? It took us about a week and a bit till we realized everyone was the same. Nobody was having luck. Markets were practically empty in the mornings. A few people from the London restaurants were coming down to buy up everything we had before any locals could. I took another sip. What was causing it? Well, my grandfather began before a long sigh. We looked in the papers and listened on the radio, but there was nothing. We thought something had spilled, but no. We were getting desperate by then, having to go further and further out. Jim and me and the rest of the lads went out for 4 days at one point, and we caught basically nothing. No one else seemed to have problems. 4 days? Wow. That's nothing nowadays, but back then you'd venture out for a day at most, really. People were hungry. Your grandmother was hungry. Some people came from the council to test the waters, but they were fine. I put my empty cup down and inched forward in the chair. He started to trail off again, but snapped back to look at me, his hands still working the skin. Anyway, the lads pulled together, which was something, but we were panicking. I don't mind telling you, Chris. Jim's wife, Mary, worked out who was behind it. Anne Lockwood. I frowned and resisted a raised eyebrow. She got herself involved with a fellow named Harry Woodley who worked in a boat. I didn't know him very well, but you, well, he was one of us. And Harry Woodley had enough of Anne Lockwood one day and got rid of her. They broke up, you mean? My grandfather nodded. Yeah, he two-timed her possibly. I'm not sure. But Anne Lockwood was a witch. I winced, and my grandfather switched his hands. He began to crack his knuckles, or attempted to anyway. I sighed as silently as I could and rolled my eyes privately. People knew about her doing that sort of thing. Her mother and grandmother had been the same. I didn't know her personally. Possibly your grandmother did, but not well, mind. But she was a witch. Everyone knew. But it was all nonsense stuff, curing colds and warts and things. I sighed again, but my grandfather was back in the story. But this was different. Harry Woodley had broken her heart, I suppose, but she decided to take it out on all of us, instead of just him. I'm sure she meant it just for us. I mean, fishermen. But then she must have realized we fed the whole place. If we starved, everyone did. I'm sorry, Grandad. She poisoned the seas, you see. She cursed it. The fish, or the sea, or both. We weren't sure exactly. She was into something darker than we thought. She was angry enough to hurt us all. I hid my face as best I could as he went on, still fiddling with his knuckles. We realized it was her. Everyone worked it out because she went round telling them. Harry Woodley knew straight away, but we didn't believe him, course. But when she went around telling everyone in the pub she'd cursed our fish, cursed the whole stock, just laughing about it, that's hard to ignore. We begged her to stop. I watched his hands. He strapped each one to the sides of his chair and stared back at the television. We tried to tell her. We did. Properly, time and again, but she wouldn't listen. She must have been hungry herself, but I don't know. When you can do that to the sea, I'm sure money doesn't matter. We told her time and again, you've got to stop. We need the fish. Our wives need the fish. Our mothers as well. But she wouldn't listen. Jim's Mary was pregnant at the time, and she was really worried. Do you want another cup of tea, Grandad? We had to do what we did. I don't feel good about it, but that's what was. We took her out, me and Jim Grant, and Terry, and Mark, and some others. We sailed right out, halfway to France really. She told us we'd suffer for it, or if we didn't, our loved ones would. Said there'd be reparations to pay. But by then, considering how difficult it was at home, Chris, we had to try. She weighed down easily. We expected something, but she just floated down like any other person. I tried to catch my grandfather's face, but it was practically sunken. It was so far away. His arms shook as they clung onto the chair. When we got back, a day later, the fish were already back. Another week, and the stocks were normal again. Of course, we should have believed Anne Lockwood about paying for it. Nothing happened first, but when Terry had his accident, I did wonder. Then Jim and Mary's boy. That was the worst, of course. Mark died just a few years later, and his wife. I do sometimes think it was a coincidence, but... He trailed off once more. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. I shuffled in my seat instead. Grandad, do you want some water or anything? Nothing happened to me, though. Nor your grandmother, or your mother. Unless you count this now. But no, I don't think so. That's just age. I don't know why, though. I took her out on that boat and dropped her in as much as the others. No reason to spare me, but there you go. Maybe just coincidences, but we did what we did for our families. His hands released the chair. He settled them back in his lap and let out a long, long sigh. I watched as his eyes began to flutter a little. Grandad? You should get going, Chris. Are you alright? He turned, his eyes bright and open, the usual cheeky smile plastered across his face. You need to get going if you're going to pick your girlfriend up on time. I checked my watch once more. Are you sure you don't want anything? I've already had my dinner. Another tea or anything? No. I'll get myself some biscuits in a while. All right, Grandad, if you're sure. Yes, my boy. I was a little late picking Beth up. She smiled as I pulled the car up and kissed me as she climbed in. You okay? She asked. Yeah, just my Grandad. You went to see him? Yeah, just now. Bad day? No. Well, he seemed pretty good when I arrived, but he got worse as I was there. Oh dear, I'm sorry, Beth said. She kissed me again on the cheek and I smiled. We drove across the town, still quiet before the 5:30 rush. You're very good to seem like you do. I don't mind. When he's alright, he tells me some funny stories. But he was bad today, at the end. I sighed and shook my head. I don't know. He just told me this bizarre, horrible story. The other day he was ranting about the Soviet Union. He just gets confused, I think. It's got to be upsetting. It's not fair, dementia. There's no justice in the world. It's difficult seeing him so different depending on the day, I said. Why was the story horrible? It was just, he said that back in the 50s or something, there'd been some fish stock crisis where all the fish had disappeared. Then he said it was something to do with some witch apparently, that had cursed the seas, and that he and some others had drowned her or something to cancel the curse. Oh God, Beth said. I know. He doesn't mean it. It's just stuff all mixed up in his brain. He can't help it, she said. I know. It's probably something on TV and everything. It's just, when he says it to you like it's real, I don't know. It's just kind of scary. Beth nodded and took my hand for a moment as I changed gears. It's difficult with grandparents. You always imagine them like they were when you were a kid, looking after you. I nodded and sneaked a quick glance at Beth, half framed against the window. I only knew one of my grannies, she said. My poor mum. She had to grow up fast. I'm sorry, I never knew. Well, you don't miss something you've never had, I guess. We pulled into the estate towards where Beth lived. I'll have to meet your gran at some point. You still need to come over and meet my mum. I will. You've been busy with your granddad. I pulled up the car outside Beth's house. She turned, smiled, and fiddled with a strand of my hair. I could come in and say hello to your mum now if you wanted. Beth shook her head. Not now. You're busy with your granddad. You sure? My other grandmother, the dead one, she died young. Kind of a family tragedy. She drowned. It was pretty terrible, apparently. My mother was very, very young when it happened, but she knew. Beth let go of my hair and leaned forward towards me. Her face stopped just before mine. I looked at her, ready to kiss, but something stopped me. Her eyes were locked straight at my own, unblinking. You might have heard of my grandmother, Chris. Her name was Anne Lockwood. I tried to pull my face away, but I couldn't. Beth stared back at me and slowly let the smile build and creep across her face. I'll see you soon, she whispered. My body fell back into the seat as Beth stepped out of the car. I caught my breath as she skipped up to her front door. My hand reached for the handbrake before she turned to look back. She smiled again as I drove my car away, my hand shaking against the wheel. A week later, my grandfather was dead. But I'm not sure the reparations have been paid yet. When the fears about the virus started to spread and the travel industry started to desperately slash their prices, my parents decided to let go of caution and grab the bargain. Their anniversary was coming up, and they could never afford a cruise in a pandemic-free world. What's the worst that could happen? No one was going to keep 2,000 people in quarantine, right? Wrong. I was meant to have the house all to myself. This weekend was going to be my weekend. I would order pizza, park myself on the couch, and spend the entirety of the next 48 hours frying my brain to whatever binge-worthy show the algorithm would throw at me. No bickering, no chores, no orders. Just me, TV, and the family pet. I spent the whole week avoiding whatever bug was going around. My hands were raw from disinfectant. I was popping vitamins like Tic Tacs. There was at least a meter between all customers and classmates that I encountered. My caution game was on point. A perfect run. My throat felt fine. My lungs felt fine. I was the pinnacle of health. Then some assholes came in with a bag of cat litter and sneezed in my face. "Sorry," he said absent-mindedly as he wiped his dumb face on his hoodie. Working in a pet store has put me in regular contact with the section of population that owns spiders and lizards. I see scores of weirdos a week. This guy could take the Social Reject Olympics gold home all year round. He was a thumb of a man hiding inside of a dirty hoodie. His eyes were vacant, his ingrown nose oozed, an expression of a moron floated on his face. I wanted to grab the straps of his hoodie and break his dumb skull on the counter, but with enough experience in customer service, you learn to choke back those impulses. I reached deep into my core for a smile. I wiped his mucus off my face. "It's okay, just hope you don't have whatever bug is going around, haha." He gurgled in response. You could drown a small animal with the amount of phlegm that was in his throat. "By card, please," he said as he extended his hand. His fingers looked dirty, pink. His credit card seemed monstrously big in their grasp. Stifling my need to scream, I rung him up and put his cat litter in a bag. His arms sunk below the counter under its weight. "Have a great weekend," I yelled, knowing that my manager was watching. The man let out a soft gurgle as he slid out to the pet store, his bag dragged behind him. I took some deep breaths, calmed down enough to help lock up, grabbed some earthworms for Rancho, and went back home. Both of my parents believed that the best way to raise a stable child was to get it a pet. A pet would teach me compassion, responsibility, and would provide me with a much-needed company children without siblings crave. I would have loved a dog, but my dad's allergy made that difficult. I would have to settle for a cat, but my mom was scared of the toxoplasma they spread. Instead, I got Rancho, the giant tortoise. Even though 17 is relatively young for a tortoise, Rancho moved with the authority of a dying dictator. Before he would enter a room, his heavy feet would announce his arrival. You could hear him deliberately stomp for attention before you could see him. Even if you had headphones in, you could sense something was off. The air would grow still, as if something horrible was about to happen. And then, just as you realized something was wrong, he would peek his cruel head in. His sagging neck seemed to extend forever. His reptilian eyes were always filled with hate. Rancho was mean. If you would touch him, he would peck you. If you were in his way, he would peck you. Hell, even if you looked at him for too long, he would start the slow journey to peck you. The only way you could get on Rancho's good side was with earthworms. When I arrived home from the pet store, Rancho greeted me in his usual fashion. A spine-chilling stare, followed by the snapping of his beak. The beast was hungry. As soon as I took out the bag of earthworms, he let out a sharp groan. "Way." When I was a kid, my dad used to joke that Rancho's barks sounded like the word "why." He would call him the philosopher turtle. When Rancho bit his toe hard enough to cause permanent damage, he didn't talk much about Rancho after that. I poured the worms into Rancho's bowl. They wiggled cluelessly among the untouched leaves of kale and iceberg. Rancho would only eat greens out of hunger. He would eat flesh out of pleasure. It took him a couple of minutes to make his way to the bowl, but when his neck was close enough, he dove for the kill. As he crunched down on his prey, bits of still moving pink flesh fell around his bowl. He fed with such ferocity you could hear his breath stop between mouthfuls. Watching him eat was like watching a car crash compilation. The brutality made you sick, but you couldn't look away. I didn't want him in the house. My father didn't want him in the house. My mother had her superstitious reasons. It's my earliest childhood memory. Me, age 3, in my crib, wearing my Cars onesie, waking up in the middle of the night. Something was shaking my crib. That something was Rancho. He had his head pushed through the bars and was snapping at my face. Wee. I screamed. I wanted to cry for help, but something else came out of my mouth. That cruel, wrinkled face brought a single word out in my mind. A single word that I hollered at the top of my little pink lungs until my parents woke up. My mother had taken a Valium and my father had gotten drunk at the funeral. When they finally came to, they found their child curled up at the edge of his crib, screaming a single word. Grandpa! I faintly remember my father lifting me out of my crib and holding me for safety. But what I remember with complete clarity is my mother's response. Through tear-drenched eyes, I could see her standing there, staring at the turtle. She had buried her father earlier that day, and here was her son invoking his name at an animal. Daddy? She asked the tortoise. Way. She hugged Rancho. He immediately bit her. It didn't matter how much my father or me wanted the beast out of our house. She wasn't going to lose her father again. Rancho shoved his maw deep into his bowl. He huffed as he searched for leftover flesh that had dropped from his jowls. Rancho was still hungry. Ding! A text from Mom. Hi honey, we're still waiting for more information from the captain. All this drama about the flu. So silly. I hope you're feeding Rancho. I fired back a yeah text. Ding! Mom. Make sure Rancho is enough water. Yeah. I'd hoped that my stomach was feeling funny because I'd watched Rancho snuff out a couple dozen lives. But even after he stomped his way into the living room, I still felt ill. The house was all mine. I could do whatever the hell I wanted to for the entirety of the weekend. All I needed to do was bolster my immune system. I chucked every fizzy vitamin tablet I could find into a glass, poured it over with water, and popped a couple of aspirins. Whatever sickness the guy in the pet store had could be sweated out. I climbed into bed and hoped to wake up healthy. I didn't. It was a fever dream. Even as I was in it, I knew it was a fever dream. I could feel my sweaty body wrestling beneath my covers. I knew I was in my bed, but I could feel something else too. Soil, dirt, all around me. A taste of copper in my mouth, pressure on my face. I was buried. I tried digging myself out, but I couldn't feel my limbs. It was as if they were all asleep. In a panic, I wiggled. I knew I was dreaming, but the earth felt so real against my face. I could feel the pressure loosening. I could feel myself wriggling out. A glint of sharp sunlight hit my face. I had made it. I had managed to wiggle out of my grave. Yet, my victory was short-lived. Within seconds, a man blotted out the sun. He was built like a bull, but carried a cane. His face was of old leather, each wrinkle telling a horrible tale. An old face which held back a bubbling anger. A Stalin who'd lived to be 100. Grandpa? I instinctively screamed as he plunged his cane into my body. He pushed down. I was buried once more. When I woke up, I still couldn't feel my arms. Throughout my nightmare, I had wrapped myself up in the blanket tightly enough to cut off all circulation. I shed my soaked bedding and desperately shook my arms around in the hope of getting back control. The first couple of seconds were scary. My arms simply flapped around like wet fish. But eventually, the blood flow returned. My weekend of freedom started out with me doing jazz hands for a good minute to make sure I could still feel my fingers. The taste of copper didn't fade. My sheets were soaked. Whatever I had come down with was something intense. I sat up on the edge of my bed, trying to get away from my sweaty imprint and survey the damage. My whole body felt weak. My throat was seized up. My head was in a vice. I was sick, all right. Where? Rancho's head peeked into the room. His eyes met mine. He looked happy, like he was celebrating me being sick. Way. His bark sounded less like a why and more like a chuckle. He was excited and hungry. I woke up feeling sick and tired, but seeing that tortoise, seeing those hate-filled eyes lit a flame in me. I wasn't going to let a little cold stop me from enjoying my weekend. Some sneezing asshole would not get to derail my lazy plans. I was going to spend the weekend enjoying junk food and watching television, flu or no flu. Even though I wasn't particularly hungry, I cracked my laptop and ordered a pizza. With enough tea and willpower, I could make myself healthy. Way, he grunted as he stomped away from my room. There was defiance in his bark, as if he knew that my plans would soon come crashing down. I was hoping that taking a shower would make me feel less feverish, but it did the exact opposite. Each droplet of water felt like a hailstone hitting my flesh. Fiddling with the warmth and water pressure did nothing. No matter how warm or gentle the stream was, it felt like I had gotten trapped in a storm. It wasn't until I got out of the shower that I noticed how much damage I had done. I was bruised. Wherever the water hit, I was covered in a torrent of blackening blemishes. As I studied myself in the mirror, I could see other signs of sickness. There were bags under my eyes. My whole body slumped with weakness. It was as if I hadn't used my arms for a month. In the time I brushed my teeth, my body was wet with perspiration again. As I groaned, I could feel phlegm gathering in the back of my throat. What? No tip? The pizza guy asked. I was going to apologize and explain to him that I didn't know when my parents were coming back, that I had to be careful with my spending cash. But before I managed to verbalize my thoughts, something else left my mouth. A sneeze. Sorry, I managed to mumble as I wiped my nose into my hoodie. The delivery guy's face went from anger to resigned defeat. It's okay. Hope you don't have whatever bug is going around, he mumbled. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell him that I also work in customer service and that I know what a bummer it is to interact with someone who doesn't cover their mouth. But the fever didn't allow that. The fever didn't permit empathy. All I managed to get out of me was a gargle. I wrapped myself up in a cocoon of blankets and occupied the couch. I had been looking forward to lazing around in front of the TV the whole week, but I couldn't focus on anything. The shows just became a flickering backdrop to my panic. My much-desired pizza just became a foul-smelling dish on the table. I started Googling on my phone. My fingers felt weak, but I kept on scrolling. Symptoms, transmission, prevention, predicted death tolls, quarantines, panic. With each minute that I spent on the web, I was more certain that whatever I caught from that sneeze was fatal. As my panic reached the crescendo, my attention was pulled away to something else. Way. Rancho stood by the couch, his yellow eyes burrowing into me. He snapped that hungry beak of his. Way. There's kale in your bowl. Leave me alone, I yelled at him. As soon as I opened my mouth, a stream of thick spit left my lips. The tortoise defiantly snapped his beak and moved towards me. Rancho has always been imposing, but yelling at him would usually scare him off. Not this time. No, Rancho could sense that I was weak. He grabbed the foot of my blanket cocoon and tugged. The beast looked ancient, but there was hidden might in that neck. I tried to push Rancho away with my feet, but they were becoming numb again. Rancho just kept on snapping at the blanket. When I lost the will to fight him, he took the sweat-soaked bedding in his mouth and started to chew. His reptilian eyes were manic. It was as if he was gnawing on a bone before a feeding frenzy. I gave up on trying to fight Rancho over my covers. I slid out of my cocoon and left him to his chewing. Whatever damage he did was my mom's problem. If it was up to me, he would have been out of the house a decade ago. Making my way back to my room was more difficult than I'd anticipated. My legs felt heavy. Each step required forethought, and even then, I felt like I was about to lose balance at any second. When I finally reached the door, it seemed impossibly heavy. My fingers burned as I pulled the handle. I collapsed in my soaked bed and wrapped myself in the filthy blankets. Shudders went through my body. This was bad. This was really bad. Mom. I put the phone on loudspeaker and placed it on my heaving chest. Mom, are you there? I'm scared. There was music in the background. Some sort of mariachi band. Honey, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is Rancho okay? Rancho's fine. He's chewing on... Look, Mom, I think I'm sick. I tilted my head forward. The phlegm was gathering in my throat. I think I have whatever they're talking about on the news. A guy sneezed in my face on Friday and... Nonsense, it's just a flu. You're being paranoid because you're watching the news. She replied in the same tone she used to assure me that there is no boogeyman when I was a kid. It was the same tone she used when my father suggested Rancho might not be the best companion for a child. But what if I'm really sick? What if I'm really, really sick? What if I'm going to die? She laughed. No one is going to die, honey. Mom, this is serious, I gargled. She took a deep breath. Honey, you just have the flu and a colourful sense of imagination. Even if you do have this big scary virus that everyone is talking about, you're young, you'll be fine. Maybe you'll have to spend a couple days in bed, but you'll be fine. It's older folks like me and your dad that should be worried. Do you see us worrying? No, we're not worried. In fact, no one is worried. Turns out everyone on the boat is healthy. This whole quarantine business was just some dumb people thinking they were being extra careful. Me and your dad will be home on Sunday. I took her words in. Her mention of my youth made my achy body feel a bit better. The panic subsided. Sure, I was sick, but suddenly it didn't feel so fatal. You'll be back on Sunday? I finally asked. We'll be back on Sunday, so you better clean up. She paused. I could faintly make out my father's voice on the phone, but the words weren't clear. Dad is saying that if you're feeling really sick, you should call a doctor. Are you feeling really sick, or can you wait till tomorrow? I can wait till tomorrow, I said without thinking too hard. Good, just make sure you get plenty of rest. Don't strain yourself. She paused for a second, as if she remembered something immensely important. Does Rancho have fresh water? Did you bring him any worms from work? Yes, Mom, I said, closing my eyes. She talked for a bit, but I drifted off. I needed the rest. I was back underground, but this time, it didn't feel like a dream. As I burrowed through the earth, it felt as if my entire human life was a prelude to something else, as if my childhood, my friends, my job, my parents were all some sort of mirage that was meant to distract me from my true purpose. As I slithered on, I could feel pebbles and roots rub against my impossibly long body. It felt good to slither. It felt good to be doing what I was meant to be doing. My arms and legs didn't feel like they were missing. It felt as if they were never there to begin with. I crawled on in a strange sort of peace, but then the ground started to shake. Stomps, loud stomps, that made it difficult to move forward. I tried to burrow deeper underground to escape it all, but the stomping simply grew stronger. The sound was deafening. The earth shook with each one, but there was something else that I heard, faintly, ever so faintly in the distance. Way, way, way. My pillow was covered in hair. My hair. I touched my head in horror, only to reveal a moist, smooth scalp. I froze, hoping that I was still in some weird fever dream, but as I tried to pinch my newly bald head, I realized something else. My hands. There was something wrong with my hands. Wiry fingers connected to sticks for arms. It was as if someone had sucked all the strength out of my arms and left behind a faint memory of bone. They felt so impossibly fragile. Way, I heard from my feet. It was Rancho. His eyes were mad with hunger. He was shoving his beastly head into the covers, fishing for something. I tried to kick him back, but my legs were asleep. I could feel his beak nestling up against my toes. And then, an indescribable wave of pain shot through my body. Memories of videos from health class warning us about the dangers of lifting weights in sandals exploded in my mind. It was just like the pain that the funny-footed athletes described, but so much worse. Way. Rancho pulled his head from beneath the covers. His beak was covered in blood, an unrecognizable color of pink in his mouth. Way, he grunted again as he launched his head back under the covers. I could feel his cold beak against my flesh, but I tucked my knees in the last moment and avoided him. I pushed myself away from the monster and slid out of the covers like a lubricated hot dog. I stared at my lower body in horror. I had no legs. My legs had disappeared beneath a long, segmented layer of skin. A human toe peeked out from beneath the foreign flesh. The bruises that covered my body after the shower had turned a dark red. Upon seeing the full monstrosity of my body, I screamed, but only bubbles of mucus escaped my throat. Way. Rancho wheezed as he climbed on top of the bed. A mad hunger played in his eyes, as if he had been starved for centuries and was about to get his first meal. I kept on pulling back, covering the already wet bed with a thick helping of blood. Way. He approached, his heavy body sinking into my mattress. Each stomp carried a wet echo. Rancho walked through puddles of my sweat and blood, his reptilian eyes screaming murder. I curled up on the edge of my bed, but he showed no signs of stopping. He just kept on coming, chomping with that sharp beak of his. I tried to calm my breath, but seeing my own blood, seeing my hair fall out, seeing that shelled beast was simply too much to handle. Shelled. My mind grabbed a hold of that word. Rancho was a lethargic lizard in a shell. I gathered my breath. I tried my best to calm down and bide my time. I waited until the spritzes of blood from my wound were hitting his face. And then I kicked him. My kick didn't push him far, but it pushed him far enough. Rancho hit the floor with a thud. He was square on his shell. Where? He growled as his neck spun around, searching for the angle to lift himself up at. His muscles bulged as he smashed his head against the ground to regain footing. His neck started to look more like a bicep. The bicep of an arm that wanted to kill me. I didn't have much time. I grabbed my phone with my new bony appendages and dragged myself by Rancho. As I moved past him, he snapped at me. Luckily enough, the thick layer of sweat that covered my body served as a lubricant. I slid my way out of the room and onto the living room carpet. Even though it felt foreign, I used my newfound tail to slam the door behind me. As soon as I hit the carpet, my strength started to run out. I was no longer sliding myself across the floor. Now I was dragging a heavy worm body with arms that audibly creaked with each pull. I pulled myself as far away from my room as I could, and then collapsed. I tried calling my parents, but they're not picking up their phone. I tried calling emergency services, but the lines are too full of people freaking out about the dumb flu that's on the news. I don't know what to do. I need help. Over the course of searching for ways to help, my fingers have progressively lost all of their feeling. They've withered even further, and I fear they will soon fall off, and I will just be a worm. Where I stopped, I thought I was safe. I thought Rancho would be trapped behind my bedroom door. But I was wrong. So wrong. I can hear him behind the door. His incessant ways are making my blood cold. He's gotten up on his hind legs and is smashing the door with his thick skull. The door isn't strong, and Rancho isn't weak. There's cracks in the wooding. Soon, he'll be out. As I lay here, a man turned worm, with my fingers slowly turning to dust. I can only ask myself one question. Why didn't that asshole cover his mouth?